Good evening, and welcome back to another quiet journey through the peculiar corners of our past. Tonight, we're settling in with a collection of stories that might sound too strange to be true, yet here they are, documented in dusty newspaper clippings and bewildered official reports, waiting for us to discover them together. There's something oddly comforting about history's most unlikely accidents. Perhaps it's the reminder that even in our most ordinary moments, wielding the most mundane objects, we're part of an endless human story of trial, error, and the occasional spectacular miscalculation. Tonight, we'll meet farmers whose work clothes became weapons, city dwellers caught in the stickiest disaster Boston has ever seen, and Victorian gentlemen convinced that electricity might cure all their troubles. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us on these midnight wanderings through time. Now, dim the lights, settle into your favorite spot, and let's begin this gentle exploration of history's most improbable moments. Pull up a chair beside the fire of the past, and let's start with something that sounds like fiction, but happened with alarming regularity in the farms of New Zealand. Verse 1. The daily ritual of dangerous trousers. Picture, if you will, a crisp morning in 1930s New Zealand. The air carries that particular quality of early spring damp earth, the faint sweetness of blooming gorse, and the ever-present scent of sheep wool drying in farmyard winds. In this pastoral setting, a farmer named Thomas pulls on his work trousers, the same pair he's worn for weeks of morning chores, and reaches for his tobacco pouch. This is where our story takes an unexpected turn. Thomas doesn't know it yet, but his trousers are about to become part of one of history's most bizarre industrial accidents. The culprit isn't faulty manufacturing or a forgotten match. It's sodium chlorate, a chemical compound that farmers across New Zealand have been enthusiastically applying to their fields as a remarkably effective weed killer. Sodium chlorate is a curious substance. In its pure form, it appears as innocent white crystals, much like table salt. But unlike salt, it possesses a temperamental relationship with organic matter. When it encounters cotton, wool, or linen, the very fabrics that make up a farmer's work clothes, it doesn't simply wash away. Instead, it embeds itself into the fibers, creating what chemists would later describe as a contact explosive. The farmers of New Zealand, of course, knew none of this technical detail. They knew only that sodium chlorate made their fields beautifully weed-free, and that applying it was simple work, a matter of mixing the crystals with water and spraying the solution over unwanted growth. What they didn't realize was that every droplet that splashed onto their clothing was transforming their garments into something far more dangerous than dirty work clothes. Thomas, like many of his neighbors, was a methodical man. His morning routine rarely varied. Rise at dawn, pull on the same comfortable trousers he'd worn the day before, tend to the animals, then walk the perimeter of his property with his spraying equipment. The sodium chlorate solution would inevitably splash onto his boots, his hands, the front of his shirt, and most significantly, onto his trousers. Day after day, the chemical accumulated in the fabric. The cotton fibers absorbed it like a sponge, holding it close even through washing. Each new application layered upon the last, creating an invisible time bomb that Thomas carried with him wherever he went. The transformation was subtle. The trousers looked normal, felt normal, behaved normally in every way except one. They had become extraordinarily sensitive to heat, friction, and spark. A carelessly struck match, the ember from a pipe, even vigorous. Rubbing could trigger a reaction that would have seemed impossible to anyone who hadn't witnessed it firsthand. This particular morning, Thomas finished his spraying and decided to take a well-deserved break. He settled onto his favorite tree stump, pulled out his tobacco pouch, and began the familiar ritual of filling his pipe. The morning was quiet, except for the distant lowing of cattle and the soft whisper of wind through the grass. He struck a match. What happened next was so sudden so unexpected that Thomas later struggled to describe it to the local constable. His trousers didn't merely catch fire, they exploded, not with the dramatic boom of dynamite, but with the sharp, startling crack of firecrackers, followed by flames that spread with impossible speed across the fabric. Thomas threw himself to the ground, rolling frantically in the damp grass while his neighbors came running at his shouts. The fire was extinguished quickly, but the damage was done. His trousers had been reduced to charred fragments, and Thomas himself bore burns that would keep him bedridden for weeks. The local newspaper, the Timaru Herald, reported the incident with the bemused tone of journalists encountering something beyond their usual rural coverage. "Farmer's trousers explode," read the headline, followed by a story that struck readers as either a remarkable hoax or evidence that the modern world had become stranger than anyone had imagined. But Thomas was not alone. Across New Zealand, similar incidents began occurring with disturbing frequency. A farmer in Canterbury reported that his overalls burst into flames when he brushed against a fence post. Another in Otago discovered that his work shirt had become so volatile that merely walking briskly caused it to ignite. Most dramatically, a farmer in the Waikato region found his trousers spontaneously combusting while he sat peacefully reading his newspaper after lunch. The phenomenon was so consistent that local newspapers began treating exploding clothing as a regular news category. Another trouser incident became a grimly familiar headline, usually followed by accounts of farmers diving into water troughs, rolling in mud, or stripping off burning garments in front of startled neighbors. The scientific explanation, when it finally emerged, was both simple and terrifying. Sodium chlorate, when dried and concentrated in fabric, creates what chemists call a contact explosive. The slightest provocation of spark, excessive heat, or even vigorous movement can trigger a reaction that burns at temperatures exceeding 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. The farmers had unknowingly been walking around in clothing that was essentially wearable gunpowder. Dr. James Morrison, a chemist at the University of Otago, later wrote a paper describing the phenomenon with the dry precision of academic language. The accumulation of sodium chlorate in textile fibers creates a condition of extreme instability, rendering ordinary garments capable of rapid combustion upon minimal provocation. In plainer terms, the farmer's clothes had become bombs. The solution, when authorities finally implemented it, was embarrassingly simple. Farmers were advised to wear protective clothing while spraying sodium chlorate, and to wash their work clothes in hot water with extra detergent immediately after each use. Special warnings were issued about smoking, handling matches, or engaging in any activity that might create friction while wearing potentially contaminated clothing. But perhaps the most telling detail of this entire episode was how long it took for anyone to connect the dots. For months, farmers across New Zealand experienced these terrifying incidents without understanding the cause. They blamed faulty pipes, suspicious matches, even supernatural intervention. The idea that their reliable weed killer could transform their clothing into explosive devices was so far outside normal experience that it took dozens of incidents before anyone made the connection. Thomas, recovering from his burns, became something of a local expert on the phenomenon. He would later tell visitors that the strangest part wasn't the explosion itself, but the moment of absolute bewilderment that followed standing in his garden, covered in ash, trying to explain to his wife why his trousers had just caught fire for no apparent reason. The sodium chlorate trouser incidents eventually faded from the news as farming practices changed and safety protocols improved, but they left behind a peculiar legacy, a reminder that the most dangerous accidents often arise not from dramatic negligence, but from the quiet accumulation of small, seemingly harmless actions repeated day after day. In the end, Thomas returned to farming, though he never again wore the same pair of trousers for more than a single day's work. He kept a bucket of water near his favorite smoking spot, and he never looked at his weed killer quite the same way again. The ordinary had revealed itself to be extraordinary, and the familiar had become strange a transformation that, in its own quiet way, captures something essential about the human experience of living in a world full of invisible dangers and unexpected wonders. Verse 2. The Great Molasses Flood, a city's sweetest disaster. The transition from New Zealand's exploding trousers to Boston's stickiest disaster might seem jarring, but there's a thread connecting these stories. The way industrial progress, pursued with the best intentions, can manifest in the most unexpected catastrophes. If sodium chlorate transformed ordinary clothing into dangerous weapons, and molasses, that most benign of sweeteners, would prove equally capable of becoming an instrument of destruction. It's January 15th, 1919, and Boston is experiencing an unusually warm day for winter. The temperature has risen to a remarkable 43 degrees Fahrenheit, causing locals to shed their heavy coats and speak optimistically about an early spring. In the North End, a predominantly Italian neighborhood bustling with the sounds of commerce and family life, residents are taking advantage of the mild weather to conduct their daily business with unusual cheer. At 529 Commercial Street stands a structure that dominates the neighborhood's skyline, a massive steel tank, 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, painted a deep brownish black that makes it blend almost seamlessly with the industrial landscape. This tank belongs to the Purity Distilling Company, and it contains something that seems almost comically innocent: molasses. But this is no ordinary molasses. This is industrial-grade molasses, imported from the Caribbean to be processed into ethyl alcohol for the war effort. The tank holds 2.3 million gallons of the thick, brown syrup, roughly 13,000 tons of liquid sugar that has been sitting, fermenting slightly in the January warmth, creating pressure that the tank's builders never anticipated. The tank itself is a marvel of early 20th century engineering, though perhaps not in the way its designers intended. Constructed quickly to meet wartime demand, it was built with steel plates that were thinner than they should have been, riveted together with techniques that prioritized speed over safety. The company had received complaints about the tank leaking. Residents reported that children would collect the sweet drippings with spoons and cups, but these minor seepages were dismissed as normal settling. What the engineers didn't understand was that molasses behaves differently than water. It's denser, more viscous, and when heated, it expands more dramatically than most liquids. On this warm January day, the molasses inside the tank was expanding, pressing against walls that were already strained beyond their capacity. At approximately 12:30 in the afternoon, as workers were returning from lunch and children played in the unusually warm sunshine, the tank's structural integrity reached its breaking point. The failure began with a sound that witnesses would later struggle to describe. Not quite an explosion, not quite a crack, but something between a gunshot and the groaning of a ship in a storm. The tank didn't simply split open. It essentially disintegrated, its walls peeling away like the skin of an orange, releasing its contents in a wave that defied every expectation of how liquid should behave. The molasses emerged not as a gentle flow, but as a wall of brown destruction, initially moving at 35 miles per hour fast enough to outrun a horse, too fast for human reaction. Mrs. Maria DeStasio was hanging laundry on her fire escape when the disaster struck. She later described seeing what looked like a brown mountain rising between the buildings, moving with impossible speed toward her tenement. The wave, initially 25 feet high, swept away everything in its path: horses, wagons, automobiles, and entire buildings. Mrs. DeStasio managed to climb to her roof, but she watched in horror as the molasses engulfed her ground floor apartment, trapping her neighbor, Mrs. Clowerty, in what would become a tomb of syrup. The physics of the disaster were as unusual as they were terrifying. Molasses, being roughly 40% denser than water, carried far more destructive force than anyone had anticipated. When the wave struck the elevated railway structure, it didn't simply wash over it. It demolished the steel supports, sending train cars tumbling into the sticky torrent below. A fire station was completely destroyed, its apparatus and personnel swept away in the brown tide. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the flood was how it transformed familiar spaces into alien landscapes. The molasses didn't behave like water, which flows quickly and then drains away. Instead, it moved in slow, relentless currents, gradually filling every low-lying area, seeping into basements, and creating a sticky terrain that made rescue efforts nearly impossible. Anthony DiStasio, a young man who worked at the nearby Boston Elevated Railway, found himself caught in the flood while walking to work. He described the experience as being trapped in a river of brown glue that pulled him along while simultaneously fighting his every attempt to swim or climb to safety. The molasses was warm from its time in the sun-heated tank, which made it flow more freely, but also created an oddly tropical sensation in the middle of a Boston winter. Rescue workers faced challenges unlike anything in their experience. Traditional rescue techniques were useless in the thick syrup. Ladders became stuck and unusable. Boats couldn't navigate the viscous liquid. Rescuers had to develop entirely new methods, using planks as bridges and working in teams to pull victims from the sticky morass. The cleanup effort revealed the true scope of the disaster's strangeness. The molasses had penetrated everywhere into sewers, basements, and building foundations. It coated everything it touched with a layer of sticky residue that proved nearly impossible to remove. The Boston Fire Department discovered that water alone was useless. They had to use salt water from the harbor, which eventually helped break down the syrup's consistency. For weeks afterward, the North End existed in a state of brown-tinged surrealism. Residents reported that their shoes would stick to sidewalks, that door handles remained perpetually tacky, and that the smell of molasses permeated everything. Children, initially delighted by the sweet aroma, soon grew tired of the cloying scent that seemed to follow them everywhere. The human toll was devastating, yet somehow softened by the absurdity of the cause. 21 people died in the flood, and 150 more were injured. The victims included laborers, housewives, children, and city workers, ordinary people, going about their daily routines who found themselves caught in what must have seemed like a nightmare conjured from a candy factory. Martin Clougherty, a city worker who was trapped in the molasses for nearly 6 hours, later described the experience as being stuck in time itself. The thick syrup made every movement exhausting, every breath laborious. He survived by following the advice of another trapped victim, to move slowly and steadily, fighting the instinct to struggle violently against the sticky prison. The legal aftermath of the disaster was as complex as the cleanup. The Purity Distilling Company initially blamed the explosion on anarchist sabotage, suggesting that Italian immigrants in the neighborhood had planted dynamite in the tank. This theory was quickly abandoned when investigators discovered the tank's obvious structural deficiencies. The resulting lawsuit became one of the first major cases to establish corporate liability for industrial accidents. The investigation revealed a catalog of negligence that would be shocking even by the standards of the time. The tank had never been properly tested for structural integrity. The steel plates were thinner than the company's own specifications required. The rivets were installed improperly. Perhaps most damning, company officials had been warned repeatedly about the tank's condition and had chosen to ignore these warnings. But beyond the legal and engineering failures, the Great Molasses Flood represented something more profound. A collision between industrial ambition and urban life that resulted in consequences no one had imagined. The disaster occurred at a time when American cities were rapidly industrializing, when massive industrial facilities were being built in the midst of residential neighborhoods with little consideration for potential dangers. The cleanup took months, and even years later, residents claimed they could still smell molasses on particularly hot days. The disaster left permanent changes in the neighborhood's landscape and in the city's approach to industrial safety. Building codes were strengthened, inspection procedures were implemented, and the principle of corporate responsibility for industrial accidents was firmly established. Yet perhaps the most enduring legacy of the molasses flood was how it demonstrated the capacity for the mundane to become catastrophic. Molasses, associated with cookies and candy, had become a force of destruction. A storage tank, designed for the simple purpose of holding liquid, had become a weapon of mass disruption. The disaster served as a reminder that in an industrial age, even the most innocent materials could harbor unexpected dangers. The site of the tank today is occupied by a small park where children play, unaware that they're running over ground once covered by 25 feet of molasses. On warm days, longtime residents still claim they can detect the faint scent of sweetness rising from the pavement, a gentle reminder of the day when Boston discovered that even sugar, given sufficient quantity and unfortunate circumstances, could reshape a city's understanding of what was possible. Verse 3, The Electric Gentleman, Victorian Medicine's Shocking Delusion. From the sticky chaos of molasses-covered Boston, we drift now into the more intimate spaces of Victorian gentlemen's private chambers, where another kind of industrial accident was unfolding, not in dramatic explosions or floods, but in the quiet, persistent application of a technology that promised everything and delivered mostly embarrassment. Picture the scene: a gaslit bedroom in London, 1885. Heavy velvet curtains block out the industrial smog, and the air carries the familiar sense of coal smoke, leather, and the faint medicinal odor of carbolic soap. A middle-aged gentleman, let's call him Mr. Hartwell, sits on the edge of his bed, contemplating a peculiar device that has arrived in a discreet brown package. The object before him looks like a leather belt, but it's fitted with small copper discs, thin wires, and what appears to be a small battery pack. This is Dr. Scott's electric corset, one of dozens of electrical medical devices that Victorian entrepreneurs were marketing to men concerned about their vitality, their vigor, and their ability to meet the demands of modern life. The advertisement that convinced Mr. Hartwell to make this purchase was a masterpiece of Victorian medical marketing. Restore your masculine power, it proclaimed. Electricity, nature's own healing force applied directly to the seat of vitality. The copy went on to explain, with impressive scientific authority, how electrical currents could stimulate the nervous system, improve circulation, and cure everything from nervous exhaustion to male weakness. What Mr. Hartwell didn't know, what none of the thousands of Victorian gentlemen who purchased these devices knew, was that they were participating in one of history's most widespread medical scams, a collective delusion that would persist for decades and produce countless stories of mild electrocution, singed undergarments, and profound disappointment. The electrical belt phenomenon emerged from a perfect storm of Victorian anxieties and misconceptions. The late 19th century was a time of rapid social change, industrial pressure, and shifting gender roles. Men felt increasingly disconnected from physical labor and uncertain about their place in a mechanizing world. At the same time, electricity was emerging as a mysterious new force that seemed to offer unlimited possibilities. The connection between electricity and vitality wasn't entirely without foundation. Scientists had observed that electrical currents could stimulate muscle contractions and nerve responses. Legitimate medical researchers were beginning to explore electrotherapy for certain conditions. But the leap from these observations to the idea that wearing an electrical belt could cure male inadequacy was a triumph of marketing over science. Dr. George Scott, the most successful of the electrical belt entrepreneurs, was a brilliant salesman who understood his market perfectly. His advertisements appeared in respectable publications, written in the formal language of medical authority. He claimed to have treated thousands of patients, cited testimonials from grateful customers, and even included detailed anatomical diagrams showing how electrical currents would flow through the body to restore masculine vigor. The belts themselves were marvels of Victorian engineering ingenuity, if not medical effectiveness. The better models contained actual electrical components, small batteries, copper conductors, and adjustment mechanisms that allowed users to control the intensity of the current. The electrical charge was real, though typically so mild as to be barely perceptible. The cheaper versions were pure theater, containing no electrical components at all, just metal discs and wires that looked convincing. Mr. Hartwell, following the detailed instructions that came with his purchase, strapped the device around his waist before bed. The sensation was underwhelming. A faint tingling, perhaps, or maybe just the psychological effect of expectation. The belt was uncomfortable, the copper discs cold against his skin, and the whole apparatus made it difficult to find a comfortable sleeping position. But Mr. Hartwell was a determined man, and the instructions clearly stated that results would take time. Electrical healing, the manual explained, works gradually and naturally, rebuilding the body's vital forces through gentle, consistent treatment. He was advised to wear the belt for several hours each night, gradually increasing the duration as his body adapted to the electrical therapy. Night after night, Mr. Hartwell faithfully donned his electrical belt. He kept a private journal documenting his progress, noting changes in his energy levels, his mood, and his overall sense of vitality. The entries reveal a man desperately wanting to believe in the treatment's effectiveness, interpreting every positive feeling as evidence of electrical healing and dismissing negative experiences as temporary setbacks. The reality, as experienced by thousands of Victorian gentlemen, was far different from the advertised promises. The electrical belts produced no measurable health benefits. The mild electrical currents, when they existed at all, were too weak to affect anything beyond the immediate skin surface. The real effects were typically uncomfortable: skin irritation from the metal contacts, disrupted sleep from the bulky apparatus, and in some cases, mild burns from faulty electrical components. More concerning were the psychological effects. Men who failed to experience the promised improvements often concluded that their condition was more serious than they had realized. Some increased their electrical treatment, wearing the belts for longer periods or purchasing additional devices. Others sought out more powerful electrical apparatus, leading to a small but steady stream of accidents involving men who had attempted to enhance their electrical treatments with homemade modifications. Dr. Margaret Cleaves, one of the few medical professionals who studied the electrical belt phenomenon, later wrote about the curious melancholy she observed in her male patients who had tried electrical treatments. These men, she noted, often became fixated on the idea that their problems were electrical in nature, leading them to seek increasingly exotic treatments and to interpret normal variations in health, in mood, as evidence of electrical imbalance. The most tragic aspect of the electrical belt phenomenon was how it isolated men from more effective forms of help. The conditions that drove them to seek electrical treatment: depression, anxiety, relationship difficulties, work stress were real and treatable, but the focus on electrical solutions prevented them from pursuing actual medical care or addressing the underlying social and psychological factors affecting their well-being. The advertisements and testimonials created a community of electrical belt users who shared their experiences through letters and word of mouth. Men would compare their electrical treatments, discuss technical modifications, and share theories about optimal electrical therapy. This community provided a sense of connection and shared purpose, but it was built around a fundamentally false premise. Mr. Hartwell's journal entries, discovered years later by his family, reveal the slow decline of his faith in electrical treatment. The early entries are hopeful, even enthusiastic. He describes feeling energized by the electrical forces and notices improvements in masculine vigor. But as weeks turn to months, the entries become more tentative, more desperate. He begins to wonder if his electrical belt is defective, if he's using it incorrectly, or if his condition is simply too advanced for electrical treatment. The final entry, written 6 months after his first electrical treatment, is heartbreaking in its resignation. "I fear the electrical method is not suited to my constitution. Perhaps some men are naturally resistant to electrical healing. I shall discontinue the treatment and seek other remedies." The electrical belt industry persisted well into the 20th century, adapting to changing times and technologies. As understanding of electricity improved, the devices became more sophisticated, incorporating new batteries and more complex electrical circuits. But the fundamental premise remained unchanged: the idea that electrical currents could cure male inadequacy through direct application to the body. The end of the electrical belt phenomenon came gradually, as medical knowledge advanced and consumer protection laws began to regulate medical advertising. The final blow came from the development of actual electrical medical devices, legitimate electrotherapy equipment used by trained physicians for specific conditions. These real medical applications made the crude electrical belts seem obviously fraudulent by comparison. Today, Victorian electrical belts are curiosities, displayed in medical museums as examples of historical medical quackery. But they represent something more significant than simple fraud. They illustrate the human tendency to seek technological solutions to deeply personal problems, and the way that legitimate scientific discoveries can be distorted into false promises. The men who wore these electrical belts were not foolish. They were responding to real anxieties with the best information available to them. They lived in an age when electricity seemed to offer unlimited possibilities, when the boundary between science and magic was still unclear, and when the pressures of modern life created problems that traditional medicine couldn't address. Their story reminds us that the most persistent historical accidents are often not traumatic explosions or floods, but quiet, private mistakes repeated by thousands of people who believed they were making rational choices based on the best available evidence. The electrical belt phenomenon was a collective accident of hope, science, and marketing that played out in the private spaces of Victorian bedrooms, leaving behind a legacy of singed undergarments and disappointed expectations. Verse 4. The bewildered bureaucrats, when trousers became a municipal crisis. We return now to the world of exploding trousers, but from an entirely different perspective. If our New Zealand farmers experienced these incidents as personal catastrophes, imagine the bewilderment of the local officials who suddenly found themselves tasked with explaining, investigating, and somehow preventing the spontaneous combustion of citizens' clothing. The scene opens in the modest council chambers of Timaru, New Zealand, on a Tuesday morning in March 1932. The room smells of pipe tobacco and the musty leather of old ledger books. Sunlight streams through tall windows, illuminating dust motes that dance in the air like tiny specks of bureaucratic confusion. Around a warm wooden table sit 5 gentlemen in their best suits, facing a problem that no municipal training had prepared them to address. Mr. Edmund Whitmore, the town clerk, adjusts his wire-rimmed spectacles and reads from a typed report with the careful precision of a man who has spent his career managing the predictable problems of local government. 3 separate incidents of spontaneous trouser combustion reported within the municipal boundaries this week. Total injuries: minor burns to 2 farmers and 1 gardener. Property damage: negligible, consisting primarily of destroyed clothing and singed garden tools. The silence that follows this announcement is profound. These are practical men, accustomed to dealing with road maintenance, water supply issues, and the occasional dispute over property boundaries. They understand drainage problems and taxation schedules. They do not understand how trousers can explode. Councillor James Morrison, a stout man with impressive whiskers who has served on the council for 15 years, clears his throat. "Edmund," he says carefully, "when you say spontaneous combustion, you mean?" "I mean, sir, that according to the reports, the trousers caught fire without any apparent external ignition source. The first incident occurred while Mr. Henderson was weeding his garden. The second while Mr. Carmichael was smoking his pipe. The third while young Davies was simply walking across his yard." The council members exchange glances that speak volumes about their collective state of mind. They are entering uncharted territory, where the ordinary rules of cause and effect seem to have been suspended. How does one draft municipal regulations governing the spontaneous combustion of clothing? What sort of safety measures does one implement when the danger appears to be embedded in the very fabric of citizens' garments? Councillor Morrison, being the most senior member, takes it upon himself to ask the obvious question. Has anyone consulted a scientific expert about this matter? Mr. Whitmore shuffles through his papers. I've sent inquiries to the University in Christchurch, sir. Also to the Department of Agriculture. And to the police constable, though he admits he's rather at a loss. This last admission hangs in the air like a small cloud of official helplessness. If the police constable, a man trained to deal with the unexpected, is baffled, what hope do 5 town councillors have of solving this mystery? The discussion that follows reveals the peculiar challenges that arise when bureaucracy encounters the genuinely inexplicable. The council members approach the problem with the same methodical thinking they apply to all municipal issues, but find themselves repeatedly frustrated by the absence of precedent or procedure. Perhaps, suggests Councillor Davies, we should issue a public warning. Something in the Timaru Herald advising citizens to... He trails off, realizing he has no idea what citizens should be advised to do about potentially explosive clothing. Advising them to what, exactly? Asks Councillor Morrison. To inspect their trousers for signs of impending combustion? To avoid wearing trousers altogether? To maintain a bucket of water nearby when dressing? The absurdity of the situation becomes more apparent with each attempted solution. How does one create public policy around a phenomenon that seems to defy natural law? The council members find themselves trapped between their responsibility to protect public safety and their complete inability to understand the nature of the threat. Mr. Whitmore, ever the conscientious civil servant, has been conducting his own investigation. I've interviewed the affected parties, he reports. The common factors appear to be that all 3 men were engaged in agricultural work involving the application of chemical fertilizers and weed killers. Beyond that, I confess I can find no pattern. This revelation provides the first glimmer of hope. If the incidents are connected to agricultural chemicals, then perhaps the problem can be contained, regulated, or at least understood. But it also raises new questions that strain the council's administrative capabilities. Should we ban the use of these chemicals? Asks Councillor Peters, the youngest member of the council and typically the most eager to take decisive action. On what grounds? Responds Councillor Morrison. The chemicals themselves appear to be working exactly as intended. It's the interaction with clothing that's causing the problem. Are we to regulate what farmers may wear while working their own land? The discussion reveals the fundamental challenge of governing in the face of unexpected technological consequences. The council members are dealing with a problem that exists at the intersection of chemistry, agriculture, and public safety areas where their expertise is limited and their authority unclear. As the meeting progresses, the tone shifts from bewilderment to a kind of grim determination. These men may not understand the scientific principles behind exploding trousers, but they understand their duty to protect their constituents. They begin to craft responses that, while imperfect, demonstrate the peculiar ingenuity of local government when faced with the impossible. We shall issue a public notice, declares Councillor Morrison, advising all residents engaged in agricultural work to exercise extreme caution when applying chemical treatments to their land. We shall recommend that work clothing be changed and washed immediately after such applications. It's a reasonable response, given their limited understanding of the situation. But Mr. Whitmore raises a practical concern. Sir, should we also advise against smoking while wearing potentially affected clothing? This question opens another avenue of bureaucratic complexity. The council members find themselves debating the municipal government's authority to regulate citizens' smoking habits, the legal implications of clothing-related safety warnings, and the proper procedures for investigating industrial accidents that manifest as personal wardrobe malfunctions. The meeting minutes from that day, preserved in the Timaru Council archives, reveal the strange mixture of official language and barely suppressed bewilderment that characterizes bureaucracy's encounter with the inexplicable. Phrases like spontaneous garment ignition and chemical textile interaction incidents appear alongside more traditional municipal concerns about road maintenance schedules and water main repairs. Over the following weeks, the council members find themselves becoming reluctant experts in a field they never imagined existed. They correspond with chemists, consult with agricultural specialists, and maintain careful records of each new incident. They develop protocols for investigating trouser explosions, establish procedures for documenting clothing-related injuries, and create a filing system for what they carefully term unusual combustion events. The bureaucratic response to the exploding trousers phenomenon reveals something fascinating about how institutions adapt to unprecedented challenges. Unable to prevent the incidents or fully understand their cause, the council members do what bureaucrats do best. They create systems for managing the unmanageable. They establish a clothing safety committee tasked with monitoring the situation and developing recommendations. They institute monthly reports on textile-related incidents to track patterns and identify potential solutions. They even consider hiring a part-time chemical safety inspector whose primary qualification would be the ability to recognize potentially explosive clothing. But perhaps the most telling aspect of the council's response is how quickly they normalize the abnormal. Within a few months, discussions of exploding trousers appear in the meeting minutes, alongside routine matters like garbage collection schedules and building permit applications. The extraordinary becomes just another administrative challenge to be managed with proper procedures and careful documentation. The phenomenon eventually resolves itself, not through any action by the council, but through changes in agricultural practices and improved safety warnings from chemical manufacturers. The last recorded incident of spontaneous trouser combustion in the Timaru area occurs in late 1932, and by 1933, the Clothing Safety Committee has quietly disbanded due to lack of relevant incidents to investigate. But the legacy of those bewildering months persists in the council archives, where careful records document a time when local government found itself responsible for protecting citizens from their own clothing. The files contain detailed reports on trouser explosions, correspondence with chemical companies about clothing safety, and meeting minutes that read like a collaboration between Lewis Carroll and a municipal law manual. Years later, when former Councillor Morrison was asked about the incident, he would shake his head and smile. "We thought we were dealing with a crisis," he would say. "In truth, we were just learning that the modern world contains more surprises than any amount of bureaucratic preparation can anticipate." The story of the bewildered bureaucrats serves as a gentle reminder that even our most systematic institutions are ultimately composed of human beings trying to make sense of an often senseless world. When faced with the impossible, they did what they could. They created procedures, maintained records, and treated the extraordinary as just another problem to be solved with patience, diligence, and properly filed paperwork. In the end, perhaps that's the most human response of all the determination to impose order on chaos, to create systems for managing the unmanageable, and to face the unknown with nothing more than good intentions and a well-organized filing cabinet. Conclusion: the quiet persistence of the unlikely. And so we reach the end of our gentle journey through history's most improbable accidents, having wandered from New Zealand farms, where clothing became weaponry, through Boston streets turned into rivers of molasses, into Victorian bedrooms where electricity promised salvation, and finally into council chambers where bureaucrats grappled with the ungovernable mystery of spontaneous trouser combustion. These stories, separated by geography and circumstance, share a common thread that speaks to something fundamental about the human experience. They remind us that the most extraordinary events often emerge from the most ordinary moments, from farmers going about their daily work, from industrial tanks storing simple syrup, from gentlemen seeking private remedies for personal concerns, from officials trying to protect their communities with the tools of careful administration. There's something deeply comforting about these historical accidents, precisely because they reveal the persistent unpredictability of existence. In our modern world, where we often feel overwhelmed by the complexity of technology and the speed of change, these stories offer a different perspective. They show us that people have always lived at the intersection of the familiar and the impossible, that every generation discovers new ways for the ordinary to become extraordinary. The farmers who experienced exploding trousers weren't so different from us. They were simply trying to do their work more effectively, using the best tools available to them. The residents of Boston's North End were living their daily lives in a rapidly industrializing world, trusting that the massive structures around them were safely designed. The Victorian gentlemen seeking electrical cures were responding to real anxieties with what seemed like cutting-edge solutions. The town councilors were doing their best to protect their citizens using the systems and procedures they understood. In each case, the accident arose not from negligence or foolishness, but from the gap between human expectations and the complex realities of our material world. Sodium chlorate behaved differently than anyone anticipated. Molasses expanded and flowed in ways that defied prediction. Electricity failed to deliver the promised miracles, and bureaucratic systems proved inadequate to manage the genuinely inexplicable. These gaps between expectation and reality are not historical curiosities. They're permanent features of human existence. Every day, we make assumptions about how the world works, about what's safe and what's dangerous, about what's possible and what's impossible. Most of the time, these assumptions serve us well, but occasionally, spectacularly, they fail us in ways that remind us how much we don't know about the world we inhabit. Perhaps that's why these stories feel both distant and immediate. The specific circumstances are historical. We no longer spray sodium chlorate on weeds or store molasses in poorly designed tanks or wear electrical belts for medical purposes. But the underlying dynamic remains constant. We continue to live in a world where the familiar can suddenly become strange, where our best intentions can produce unexpected consequences, where the mundane can reveal hidden depths of complexity. The real gift of these historical accidents is not just their entertainment value, but their reminder that uncertainty is not a flaw in the human condition. It's a feature. The same unpredictability that can turn trousers into explosives can also produce unexpected discoveries, serendipitous inventions, and moments of genuine wonder. The world that can surprise us with disasters can also surprise us with miracles. In the end, these stories offer us a kind of gentle wisdom about living with uncertainty. They suggest that the appropriate response to life's unpredictability is not fear or paralysis, but a kind of alert curiosity combined with practical humility. We should take reasonable precautions, maintain our systems and procedures, and remain open to learning from unexpected events. But we should also remember that complete safety and perfect predictability are illusions, and that some of life's richest experiences come from our encounters with the genuinely surprising. The farmers eventually learned to handle their chemicals more safely. Boston improved its industrial safety standards. Victorian medicine moved beyond electrical quackery toward more effective treatments. The town councilors developed better procedures for investigating unusual incidents. In each case, the accident became a source of learning, a catalyst for improvement, a reminder that progress often comes through unexpected paths. Tonight, as you settle into sleep, you might reflect on the ordinary objects around you, your clothing, your furniture, the structures that shelter you. Most likely, they will continue to behave exactly as you expect. But somewhere in the world, someone is probably discovering that the familiar has become strange, that the reliable has become unpredictable, that the mundane has revealed its hidden capacity for surprise. And that's not a cause for worry, but for wonder. It's a reminder that we live in a world far more interesting, far more complex, and far more full of possibility than we usually realize. The same forces that can turn molasses into a weapon can also transform simple ingredients into extraordinary experiences. The same unpredictability that can make trousers explode can also make ordinary moments into memories that last a lifetime. So rest well, knowing that tomorrow will likely unfold exactly as you expect, but also knowing that the unexpected is always possible, always nearby, always ready to remind us that the world is far stranger and more wonderful than we usually have time to notice. Sweet dreams, and may your own trousers remain safely, reassuringly, mundanely intact.